The cruiser USS Houston limps through the darkness of the Java Sea, her rear turret blown off, her crew exhausted from weeks of constant combat, and Japanese radio broadcasts already claiming she's been sunk 3 times. Tokyo Rose calls her the galloping ghost of the Java coast because somehow, impossibly, Houston keeps surviving when every other Allied ship around her has been destroyed. But on this night, March 1st, 1942, Houston's luck is about to run out. She's sailing straight into the largest Japanese invasion fleet of the war with no air cover, no support, and almost no ammunition left. Her captain knows this is probably a suicide mission, but he's taking his ship into battle anyway because that's what the mission requires. In the next few hours, Houston will fight one of the most desperate naval battles in American history, and 693 men will go down with her. This is the story of how a heavy cruiser became a legend, how her crew fought to the last shell, and why the survivors would spend 3.5 years in hell that made the battle seem merciful by comparison. Let's start with understanding who Houston was and what she meant to the U.S. Navy before the war. USS Houston was a Northampton-class heavy cruiser commissioned in 1930. She was a beautiful ship, 600 feet long, displacing about 10,000 tons, armed with 9 8-inch guns in 3 turrets and capable of over 32 knots. But more than her specifications, Houston had prestige. She was President Franklin Roosevelt's favorite ship. FDR had used her several times for diplomatic cruises and reviewing the fleet. Houston was flagship material, representing American naval power in peacetime. When war came to the Pacific in December 1941, Houston was part of the Asiatic fleet based in the Philippines. She was one of the few modern heavy cruisers available to face the Japanese onslaught that was about to sweep across Southeast Asia. The first months of the Pacific War were catastrophic for Allied forces. Pearl Harbor destroyed the battleship fleet. The Philippines was invaded. Malaya fell. Singapore surrendered. The Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia, was being conquered piece by piece. The small Allied naval force in the region, American, British, Dutch, and Australian ships collectively called ABDA Command, was completely outnumbered and outgunned. They couldn't stop the Japanese advance. They could only delay it and try to inflict casualties while retreating. Houston was in the middle of this disaster, fighting in multiple engagements as Allied forces were pushed back steadily. Houston's troubles started early. On February 4, 1942, she was in the port of Darwin, Australia, when Japanese aircraft attacked. Bombs hit near Houston and caused damage, but she remained operational. Then, on February 15th, Japanese bombers attacked Houston south of Java. This attack was much worse. A bomb hit Houston's rear turret, Turret 3, killing 48 men and destroying the turret completely. The explosion was catastrophic. The turret was blown open and couldn't be repaired in the time available. Houston went from having 9 main guns to 6. This was a serious reduction in combat capability, but there was no time for proper repairs. The ship would have to fight with what she had. Despite this damage, Houston continued operating with the ABDA fleet. She fought in the Battle of the Java Sea on February 27th, one of the most chaotic naval battles of the war. The ABDA fleet, commanded by Dutch Rear Admiral K.L. Doorman, tried to intercept a Japanese invasion convoy heading for Java. The resulting battle was a disaster for the Allies. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and defeated decisively. Several Allied ships were sunk, including the Dutch flagship De Ruyter with Admiral Doorman aboard. Houston survived the battle but expended most of her ammunition. She was down to fewer than 50 rounds for her main guns. That's less than 10 salvos total. A normal ammunition load was hundreds of rounds. Houston was nearly defenseless, but she was still afloat, and her crew was determined to keep fighting. After the Java Sea battle, Houston and the Australian cruiser HMAS Perth headed for the port of Tanjung Priok near Batavia on Java to refuel and hopefully get more ammunition. The situation was desperate. Java was about to fall. The ABDA command structure had collapsed. Allied forces were evacuating what they could and abandoning what they couldn't. Houston and Perth were ordered to head south through the Sunda Strait to reach the open ocean and safety. But on the night of February 28th to March 1st, as the two cruisers approached Sunda Strait, they ran straight into a massive Japanese invasion force. Over 50 Japanese transport ships and their escorts were landing troops at Bantam Bay on Java's western coast. Houston and Perth had blindly sailed into the middle of the largest Japanese amphibious operation to date. The Japanese were just as surprised as the Allied ships. Nobody expected enemy warships to sail into the middle of an invasion, but the Japanese had overwhelming superiority in numbers. Houston and Perth were two cruisers against dozens of Japanese warships and transports. The two Allied cruisers could have run, but that wasn't an option anyone considered. They'd attack the transports, sink as many as possible, and disrupt the invasion. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only honorable choice. At about 11:00 p.m. on February 28th, Houston and Perth opened fire on the Japanese transports at close range. The chaos that followed was one of the strangest naval battles of the war. Houston and Perth charged into Bantam Bay, firing at transports. They sank several and damaged others. Japanese destroyer escorts and cruisers converged on the two Allied ships from multiple directions. The Allied ships were taking fire from all sides, but they kept fighting. Houston's 6 remaining main guns fired as fast as the crews could load them. The ammunition supply was so low that every shot counted. The secondary guns and anti-aircraft weapons fired at any target they could see. The Japanese had night fighting advantages with better optics and more experience with night combat. They also had the Long Lance torpedo, probably the best torpedo in the world at that time. But Houston and Perth were fighting with desperate courage. Perth was hit by torpedoes first. She took multiple hits and started sinking around midnight. Her crew abandoned ship, and Perth went down in the Sunda Strait. Houston was now alone against the entire Japanese force. Captain Albert Rooks ordered Houston to try to break out of Bantam Bay and escape. The ship turned south, trying to reach the open ocean. But Japanese ships were everywhere. Torpedoes were in the water from multiple directions. Japanese cruisers and destroyers were firing on Houston from close range. The ship was hit repeatedly. Shells penetrated the hull. Fires broke out. Men were killed at their stations, but Houston kept fighting back with everything she had. Around 12:30 a.m. on March 1st, Houston's ammunition for the main guns ran out. All 50 of the precious remaining shells had been fired. The 8-inch guns fell silent. Houston was now defenseless against the Japanese cruisers that were pounding her with shells, but the secondary 5-inch guns kept firing. The anti-aircraft guns kept firing. The crew wasn't giving up even though the situation was hopeless. Captain Rooks was killed by shell fragments on the bridge. The executive officer took command. More torpedoes hit Houston. The ship was flooding. Power was failing. But still the crew fought on. By 1:00 a.m., Houston was dead in the water and sinking. The order was given to abandon ship. Survivors jumped into the water or slid down ropes. Some grabbed anything that would float. The ship was settling rapidly. Men were still jumping off as Houston rolled over and sank. From the start of the battle to Houston's sinking was about 2 hours. In that time, she'd fought against overwhelming odds, sunk multiple transports, damaged others, and fought until literally out of ammunition and sinking. Of Houston's crew of about 1,060 men, approximately 693 went down with the ship or died in the water. About 368 survived the sinking, but their ordeal was just beginning. The survivors in the water faced multiple dangers. Some were injured in the battle, all were exhausted. The water was full of debris, burning oil, and bodies. Japanese ships were still in the area, and some survivors were machine-gunned in the water, a war crime that was sadly common in the Pacific War. Others were picked up by Japanese ships or made it to shore. Those who reached shore were captured by Japanese forces. By March 2nd, most of Houston's survivors were prisoners of war. They had no idea that their real nightmare was just starting. Japanese prisoner of war camps were among the most brutal in history. Houston's survivors were scattered across multiple camps throughout the Japanese-occupied territories. Some ended up in Java. Others were sent to Burma to work on the infamous Burma Railway, the death railway where tens of thousands of Allied POWs and Asian laborers died from disease, malnutrition, and brutal treatment. Houston's survivors worked on this railway in indescribably harsh conditions. Starvation rations, tropical diseases, beatings for any perceived infraction. Men are dying daily from disease, exhaustion, or execution. The Burma railway work was killing work. Prisoners worked 12 to 16 hours a day in tropical heat, building a railway through jungle and mountains. They had minimal tools, no safety equipment, inadequate food, and no medical care. Dysentery, malaria, cholera, and other diseases ravaged the camps. Men who became too sick or weak to work were beaten or killed. Some Houston survivors simply collapsed and died from exhaustion and malnutrition. Others succumbed to disease. A few were executed for attempting escape or for infractions of camp rules. The Japanese showed minimal concern for prisoner welfare and actively brutalized them. This wasn't negligence. This was deliberate cruelty. Of the 368 Houston survivors who made it to shore, only 291 survived Japanese captivity to be liberated in August 1945. That means 77 additional Houston men died as POWs. When you add this to the 693 who died in the battle or immediately after, Houston's total casualties were 770 men out of 1,060, over 70%. This was one of the highest casualty rates of any U.S. Navy ship in the war. The ship herself was gone, sunk in the Sunda Strait, but her men's suffering continued for 3.5 years in camps that made combat seem merciful by comparison. The survivors who made it home in 1945 were physical and psychological wrecks. They'd lost an average of 50 pounds each. Many had permanent health problems from tropical diseases and malnutrition. They had scars from beatings and infections, but the psychological damage was worse. They'd watched friends die in battle, then watched more friends die slowly in camps. They'd been systematically brutalized for years. Many suffered what we'd now call PTSD, but in 1945 was barely recognized as a medical condition. These men came home to a country that was celebrating victory and had no concept of what POWs in Japanese hands had endured. Meanwhile, Houston had become famous during the weeks she survived after supposedly being lost at sea. Tokyo Rose, the English-language propaganda broadcaster, kept announcing Houston's destruction, but Houston kept showing up and fighting. American propaganda embraced this. Houston became the galloping ghost of the Java coast, a ship that couldn't be killed, a symbol of American determination. The truth was more complex. Houston survived longer than most Allied ships in the region, but she was a damaged ship, fighting hopeless battles in the final weeks before Allied resistance in the Indies collapsed. Her survival was less ghostly and more a testament to her crew's skill and determination. When news of Houston's actual sinking reached the United States, it was a shock. She'd been such a symbol of resistance that people wanted to believe she'd survived the entire war. Learning that Houston and most of her crew were gone was painful. The Navy awarded numerous decorations to Houston's crew for their final battle. Captain Rooks received a Medal of Honor posthumously. Many others received Navy crosses, silver stars, and other decorations. But medals couldn't bring the dead back or erase the suffering of the survivors. The question that Houston survivors and historians have asked since is whether the final mission was necessary. Houston and Perth sailing into Bantam Bay disrupted the Japanese invasion temporarily and sank several transports. But was this worth the loss of 2 cruisers and hundreds of lives? Java fell anyway within days. The 2 cruisers couldn't stop the invasion. Some argue it was a pointless sacrifice. Others argue that naval forces have a duty to engage the enemy when encountered, and that Houston and Perth fought honorably, even if the strategic impact was minimal. There's no easy answer. War creates these impossible situations where every choice involves tragedy. The recovery of Houston's wreck site came decades later. The wreck lies in about 100 feet of water in the Sunda Strait. It's a war grave and a protected site. Indonesian authorities and the US Navy have worked to preserve it. But like many Pacific War wrecks, Houston has been disturbed by salvagers looking for scrap metal. This is deeply disrespectful to the men who died there, but economically valuable in the region. Efforts to protect the site continue, but enforcement is difficult in remote waters. The wreck of Houston is a tomb for nearly 700 American sailors, and it deserves to be left in peace. Houston survivors formed a survivors association after the war to stay connected and support each other. These reunions continued for decades as the survivors aged and their numbers dwindled. The last Houston survivor died in 2020, nearly 80 years after the battle. With their passing, the living memory of Houston's final fight and the captivity that followed passed into history. Now we rely on their written accounts, their recorded interviews, and historical documentation to understand what they experienced. These sources are precious because they preserve testimony that would otherwise be lost. The legacy of USS Houston is complicated. She was a good ship with a good crew that fought bravely in impossible circumstances. She became famous as the Galloping Ghost, a symbol that lifted American morale when most news from the Pacific was bad. But the reality was tragic. The ship was lost. Most of the crew died either in battle or in captivity. The survivors who came home were broken in ways that many never fully recovered from. Houston's story is inspiring and heartbreaking in equal measure. It shows courage and sacrifice, but also the brutal waste of war and the horror of Japanese POW camps. For modern audiences, Houston's story is a reminder that naval warfare in the early Pacific War was desperate and often one-sided. The Japanese had numerical superiority, better torpedoes, more experience with night fighting, and controlled the air. Allied ships were fighting delaying actions and losing. Houston's final battle was typical of this period. A few Allied ships were trying to do damage against overwhelming odds, fighting until sunk, and crews either died in battle or faced years of brutal captivity. This was the reality for Allied naval forces in early 1942, and Houston exemplified both the courage and the tragedy of that period. The treatment of Houston's survivors as POWs remains one of the darkest aspects of the Pacific War. The brutality of Japanese camps, the death rates, and the deliberate cruelty are historical facts that shouldn't be forgotten. But they also shouldn't be used to dehumanize all Japanese people or to create simplistic narratives about good versus evil. The Japanese military in World War II committed terrible crimes. Individual Japanese soldiers and camp guards were capable of extraordinary cruelty, but reducing this to racial or cultural stereotypes misses the complex reality. War brings out the worst in people and institutions, and the Japanese military system in that era was particularly brutal to prisoners. Understanding this historically is important. The Houston survivors who wrote memoirs or gave interviews often expressed complex feelings about their Japanese captors. Some felt only hatred. Others acknowledged that a few Japanese guards showed moments of humanity even in the camps. Many struggled with forgiveness decades after the war. Some survivors eventually visited Japan and met former enemies in reconciliation efforts. These personal journeys toward or away from forgiveness reflect how complicated the aftermath of such trauma can be. There's no single right way to process what Houston's survivors experienced. Each man dealt with it in his own way. The families of Houston's crew faced their own trauma. Many didn't learn their loved ones' fates for months or years. Houston was listed as sunk in March 1942, but which crew members survived and which died wasn't immediately known. Families spent months or years not knowing if their sons or husbands or fathers were dead or prisoners. This uncertainty was its own form of torture. When lists of survivors in Japanese camps finally reached the United States through neutral channels, families frantically searched for their loved ones' names. Finding a name meant hope, but it also meant years of worry about survival in camps. Not seeing a name usually meant death, though some families held out hope throughout the war, only to learn in 1945 that their loved one had died in 1942. The strategic context of Houston's loss is important for understanding why the ship was where she was that final night. By late February 1942, the Allied position in the Dutch East Indies was hopeless. Java would fall regardless of what Houston and Perth did. Some naval historians argue that the ships should have been evacuated earlier rather than being risked in futile battles. Others say that maritime forces have a duty to contest enemy advances regardless of strategic outcome. This debate isn't about courage. Everyone acknowledges Houston's crew fought bravely, but it's about whether senior commanders used their forces wisely. The answer affects how we judge the sacrifices made. Houston's name lived on. A new Cleveland-class light cruiser was commissioned as USS Houston CL-81 in December 1943. This Houston served through the rest of the war and beyond, participating in multiple Pacific campaigns. She was a worthy successor to the name. After the war, submarines and other vessels were named Houston. The city of Houston, Texas, has always maintained a special connection to Navy ships bearing the city's name. Memorials in Houston honor the crew of the original Houston. These memorials ensure that the sacrifice of those 770 men isn't forgotten. The technical aspects of Houston's final battle are worth examining because they show how the ship was fought. Captain Rooks decided to attack the transports rather than try to escape immediately. This was aggressive but appropriate for a naval officer who saw enemy forces vulnerable to attack. The navigation through Bantam Bay while under fire from multiple directions required skill. The gunnery, despite limited ammunition, was accurate enough to sink several transports. The damage control teams kept Houston fighting longer than the damage she sustained should have allowed. All of this speaks to a well-trained, disciplined crew executing their duties under the worst possible circumstances. They did everything right and still lost because the odds were simply insurmountable. If this account of Houston's desperate last battle and her crew's 3-year nightmare in Japanese camps moved you, if it showed you a ship and crew who deserved better than they got, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We are telling the stories that need to be remembered, the battles that ended in defeat but were fought with honor, the suffering that continued long after the guns fell silent. Thank you for watching. Remember, every ship that sank was filled with men who had families and futures. Houston's 770 casualties were 770 individual tragedies that collectively represent the cost of war.